Hi, welcome to my talk for the Australian Linguistic Society Conference 2020. It's part of a workshop on building bridges between typology, sociolinguistics, and contact linguistics. First, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm giving this talk from Melbourne on the land of the Wurundjeri people, whose language is Woiwurrung. I'd also like to make visible the collaboration that's within this research with Warrawee community, a community in the north of Australia. And these are some of the people I work with there. And I'd also like to acknowledge collaboration with other academics such as Isabel O'Keefe, who you can see here. So I'm going to start my talk by giving a very brief introduction to small-scale multilingualism. And I'm going to talk about some of the recent work on small-scale multilingualism that's identified similarities across sites spread around the world. Then I'm going to talk about what I think is the next step in research on small-scale multilingualism, which is looking at language contact and change, and give a few examples from Western Arnhem Land where I do my research. So just to introduce you to small-scale multilingualism, I'll give an example of Western Arnhem Land. In this area, languages from 4 Indigenous language families are still spoken, as well as English, and as many as 15 are spoken in a single community. Adults are highly multilingual, and speaking 8 languages is not uncommon. Children grow up with at least 2 Indigenous languages from birth, and they also grow up learning to understand yet more languages. This is what I refer to as receptive multilingualism, understanding languages but not speaking them. And it's an important part of the practice of non-accommodation at Warrawee community, where I've done my research, which involves people speaking to one another in different languages without always feeling a need of one to accommodate to the language of the other. The picture you'll see at the top here is a language portrait, which is a method I use for researching multilingualism. And during interviews, people sometimes color these pictures with their different languages. There's been a wealth of recent research on small-scale multilingualism. This has covered areas of West Africa, parts of Papua New Guinea, parts of lowland South America, parts of Siberia, Northern Australia, and parts of Vanuatu and other areas in the Pacific. Based on this research and earlier research, we know that there's a great diversity in small-scale multilingualisms around the world. We also know that there's diversity within diversity. For example, some villages in a region of small-scale multilingualism might be highly multilingual, whereas in others, most people may speak only 1 or 2 languages. There's a number of similarities that we find across sites of small-scale multilingualism, which is partly what's led to this snowballing and greater comparison across sites. I proposed a couple of points in 2016. Local languages have a relatively small number of speakers relative to other languages of the area. Marriages across language groups are the norm, although not necessarily obligatory. And multiple languages are used within each family or household. And highly multilingual repertoires are not remarkable. Research on small-scale multilingualism has taken an ethnographic approach. Ethnographic methods are highly qualitative and not designed to produce comparable data, but still many common trends have emerged. For example, patrilineal language affiliation being primary. That is, the language of your father or your father's father is the one which is most important to your identity. This contrasts with the idea of the mother tongue, which is common across Europe. Also, receptive multilingualism often seems to be widespread. This is in part because people want to stick with their language of identity as much as possible and use that as much as they can. Sometimes other people don't speak that language, but if they understand the language, then it's still possible to use that language to talk to them. Also, an observation that's been made is that there's no polyglossia, which is why small-scale multilingualism is sometimes referred to as egalitarian multilingualism. The idea is that no one language is seen as essentially better than the other. Although each language is associated with a different area or village, and in that place it may be seen as more important, on a regional level, neither language is seen to have essentially a greater value than the other. It's been argued that the high value that communities place on being distinctive is what leads to the cultivation of diversity in a number of areas in these regions, including language. David Munro from Warrawee community described this value as being different together to musicologist Reuben Brown, and it has been observed by others to be the cornerstone of Indigenous Australian social organisation at a regional level. In the grassfields of Cameroon, multilingualism gives access to more spiritual power. So, multiple languages means connections to multiple villages, each with a chief who heads a different cult. This also shows that this idea of being different together creates a tight network where people have strong identities, but also able to claim multiple identities. In the Valpes region of the Amazon, complementary trades, the manufacture of different items by each language group, makes groups rely on each other in a practical way as well. The best way to understand small-scale multilingualism is as a regional system, not as a feature of a village or a community. The system extends beyond individual languages, creating a large-scale multilingual speech community. For example, cross-linguistic patterns of variation may be evident. The system extends beyond language. So as linguists, we have to strain our brains to try and encompass areas which are not language. Regional sociocultural frameworks, these ideas of being different together, underpin the patterns of multilingualism. Individual communities may be more or less multilingual, but this does not matter. The regional system is broader than a Sprachbund because it's not defined by linguistic features. A quote from Patty Epps' recent book chapter puts this together. She's talking about lowland South America, and she says, while local perspectives emphasize difference, both in language and cultural practice, the distinctions among groups facilitate their functioning together as a system of interdependent complementary parts. So people talk a lot about how different they are from their neighbours, and of course from people who identify with different languages within their household. But these differences actually form the basis of a tight network. So studies of small-scale multilingualism up to this point have mainly focused on two aspects. The first is language ideologies. A lot of early work by anthropologists particularly recorded beliefs that people had about language. More recently, linguists have started to do detailed study of language practices, recording multilingual language use and analysing it. As I see it, there's a number of other steps in the research on small-scale multilingualism to get to a real understanding of how it generates linguistic diversity. One of them is bilingual cognition, understanding how things like receptive multilingualism work in the brain. I'm going to hop over this block for most of this talk and focus on other things. Language contact and language change, which is what people are starting to look at now. The research on language ideologies and language practices has drawn on long-term collaborations between linguists, community members, and often local universities. Linguists who specialised in language documentation have drawn on ethnographic methods from linguistic anthropology and qualitative sociolinguistics. This has been a big step for a lot of linguists, particularly those who didn't have any training in qualitative research and linguistic anthropology. The next step is perhaps more familiar territory. Moving into research on language contact and language change. However, much research on these areas has drawn on research communities where there's quite a lot of documented history. What we find in places where there's small-scale multilingualism is we're often in very remote areas, a long way from the central government, and these areas have not been documented historically. Sometimes there's been a lot of anthropological work. In most cases, there hasn't been much. And of course, we also don't have records for studying language change. We have to use contemporary data. So research on language contact and language change promises to answer the question of why regions of small-scale multilingualism are more diverse. For example, do specific multilingual practices favor diversification by creating conditions for different kinds of language change? Specifically, how might we identify those pathways? So, an area I've started looking at is contact between three languages, which are all spoken at Wadawi community. Two languages of the Kunwinjku family, Kunbarlang and the Kunwinjku variety of Biningunwok, and Mawng, a member of the Awaijan language family. Looking across Arnhem Land, we can see four large language families: Awaijan, Kunwinjku, Pamanyungan, and Manangreden in the green circle. The area of land in the red circle is owned by clans that speak Mawng, Kunbarlang, and Kunwinjku. And historically, they had close relationships, particularly, it seems, based on the evidence, Mawng and Kunbarlang. The two Kunwinjku languages in this three-language sample are quite different, although they are genetically part of the same family. Kunwinjku is now considered a large language of the area. It's the most used variety of Biningunwok, which has around 1,200 first language speakers, and probably around 2,000, including second language speakers. Most Mawng-speaking adults at Wadawi speak Kunwinjku, and the rest understand it very well. Kunbarlang is unusual among the Kunwinjku family in that it is spoken on an area of land on the coast. All the other Kunwinjku languages are inland, or as they call it up there, freshwater. There's few younger speakers. Most Kunbarlang speaking families have shifted to a variety of Biningunwok or Mawng. Kunbarlang speakers usually also speak Kunwinjku or Kunwinjku variety of Biningunwok, and often also Mawng. The other unusual thing about Kunbarlang and Biningunwok is they don't have that much shared vocabulary. This is only a very small study. We need to look at more words, but it found 32% of shared basic vocabulary in a 150 word list. Whereas it's not that different what's shared between Mawng and Kunbarlang and Biningunwok. So Kunwinjku is like a big language, while Mawng and Kunbarlang are small languages. Even though they're all very small on a global scale, the relative size is important at the local level. So we might expect to find two-way interaction between Mawng and Kunbarlang, but mainly a one-way influence of Kunwinjku on the other two. Mawng and Kunbarlang have a number of unusual grammatical constructions in common. For example, the noun markers or articles that agree in gender. These are small words, for example, the da in Dagunak in Mawng, which precede the noun and indicate its gender. These are not found in any other languages of the area. Mawng and Kunbarlang also have grammaticalized coverb constructions, which are found in a number of Australian Indigenous languages, but not really in this area of Australia. So for example, the Mawng coverb construction, ngaran Pulanalk, I forgot. Mawng, Kunbarlang and Kunwinjku, Mawng's sister language, both have this rather odd reciprocal construction, a fossilized periphrastic construction, which is very rare worldwide. So this seems to be quite a bit of evidence of intense contact between speakers of Mawng and Kunbarlang, which is what we might expect, considering that they are spoken by people who own adjacent areas of land on the coast, and there's a lot of interaction between coastal groups. The direction of influence seems to be mainly from Mawng into Kunbarlang. So, how can we explain the link between small-scale multilingualism and high levels of diversity? By moving along through this chain of building blocks, I think we can get to a much deeper understanding of what the link is and of how diversity develops in situ within small regions. The foundation of this research is the collaborative, ethnographically informed work on language ideologies and practices, the first two building blocks. The next step is to identify evidence for language contact and reconstruct language change, and then integrate these findings with understandings of bilingual cognition. Alongside this work, I'm also looking at psycholinguistic experiments of people with receptive multilingualism, so ability to understand a language well but not speak it. As we go through these 5 building blocks, we also need to make comparisons across different sites of small-scale multilingualism around the world and within each region. And I think we'll get a much better hold on this question of what the link is between small-scale multilingualism and linguistic diversity. Thanks very much. If you'd like a copy of the presentation, email me, or I do plan to put it online as well. Thanks very much.